and welcome to this launch of the Australia-Southeast Asia Relations and Post-COVID-19 Regional Order Policy Brief. My name is Beck Strading. I'm the Executive Director of La Trobe Asia at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. I would like to begin this webinar event by acknowledging the elders of the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which La Trobe University sits, although we are on Zoom. So I'd like to acknowledge the fact that our panellists are located on the lands of different traditional custodians across Australia. So I would like to extend my respect to elders past and present, and to Indigenous Australians who are watching this webinar this afternoon. So part of our role at La Trobe Asia is to engage the public in meaningful discussion and debate, and to deepen our understanding and knowledge of the Asian region. And as part of this mission, La Trobe Asia produces a dedicated series of policy briefs that provide analysis and recommendations on topical issues concerning our region. The Australia-Southeast Asia Relations and the Post-COVID-19 Regional Order Brief is the fifth policy brief that we have produced in this series, and it features 12 opinion pieces from experts from across Australia and Southeast Asia. These articles provide in-depth analysis on the state of Australia and Southeast Asian relations and recommendations for how these can be deepened as the region enters into a phase of pandemic recovery. The publication is the result of a productive and positive collaboration between La Trobe Asia, Asia Centre in Bangkok, Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Indonesia, the Institute of Strategic and International Studies in Malaysia, Griffith Asia Institute, Asialink, Perth US Asia Centre, and Generate Worldwide. This collaboration has been generously supported by the Australian ASEAN Council. So I am really delighted to be joined by four outstanding experts to assist in launching this brief. We were originally hoping to run this event face-to-face, but as the COVID-19 situation has been unfavourable, shall we say, I am grateful that four of our excellent colleagues and collaborators have been able to join us through the magic of Zoom. So first we have Dr. Huong, who is a senior analyst at the Defence and Strategy Program at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, where she leads projects on Southeast Asia security and diplomacy. Huong is a great friend of La Trobe Asia's, and we are grateful for your contribution to the brief and for joining us tonight. Dr. Jeffrey Wilson is the Research Director at the Perth US Asia Centre. He specialises in the regional economic integration of the Indo-Pacific, specifically the politics of trade agreements, regional economic institutions, and Australia's economic ties with Asia. Perth US Asia Centre, as I mentioned before, was one of our partners in this collaboration, and Jeff has contributed a piece to the policy brief. So it's great to have you here, Jeff, zooming in from Perth. Professor Caitlyn Byrne is the Director of Griffith Asia Institute at Griffith University. Her research focuses on Australian diplomacy with a special interest in Australia's engagement within the Asia-Pacific region, including Southeast Asia. Griffith Asia Institute was also a key partner in this collaboration, and Caitlyn has also provided an article for our brief. So it's great to see you here too, Caitlyn, coming in from Brisbane. And last but certainly not least is Chen Li, who is an advisor diplomacy to Asialink at the University of Melbourne. She is also a senior fellow with the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, and we are grateful that Asialink was also able to come on board with this partnership, and Chen has contributed a piece on Australia-Singapore relations to the brief. So welcome, Chen. There will be time for Q&A in the second half of the webinar, for which we will be using the Q&A function. So please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A box as we go along, and I'll get to them after our panelists have had an opportunity to share some thoughts on Australia-Southeast Asia relations. But I am going to start by asking Huong a question about the key security trends in Southeast Asia. I mean, what is changing geopolitically, and what effect has COVID-19 had on regional security in Southeast Asia?
Thank you, Beck. It's really good to be with you and share the panel with my great friends. And hello to some of the familiar faces in the audience as well. Some of them also contributed to the report, so it's good to see such a great audience. Thank you for this question. I think at the time when we wrote the report and now, some things have changed a little bit. Well, the fact that we can't get together and do it physically is one thing, and it's a constant actually reminder that this pandemic and virus is not going away anytime soon. It's a forever virus, and it's affecting us in every possible way, and it's not going to stop anytime soon. This is a strategist response, so a warning that it's going to be a little bit pessimistic because I worry a lot about the region. At the time of writing, I thought there's a lot of optimism in how Southeast Asia dealt with the virus, with the pandemic in previous year. And there's a lot of faith in the region's resilience. So while macro trends, that geopolitical trends would disrupt and challenge the region, I thought the prospect of the region recovering soon or going to the recovery phase would in a foreseeable future. And most of economic projections actually also expect a fast V-shaped kind of recovery, at least in many of Southeast Asian countries. But as we speak now, I think in the recent weeks and months, the Delta variant is really stressing the whole region. And I think the prospect of fast recovery is probably too premature. I do worry about region's resilience, not because the region is not resilient in a way, but I think a prolonged effect of pandemic is hard on everyone. And the pandemic has affected Southeast Asia in a very different way. So first year, I think by and large, in global scale, Southeast Asia was doing very well. Relatively well, of course, the Philippines and Indonesia had struggled more than the rest. But at the moment, I think we are seeing across the region, even countries that dealt with the virus well, like Vietnam and Thailand, are struggling because we are now not just in the phase of how good is governance or how effective is governance in containing the spread, but we really are in the phase of recovery and vaccine rollout. And this is where the great powers also come into play, right? Just before pandemic, we already had experienced the region very nervous about great power competition, the decoupling, and the raising attention around the region related to great power activities. Now, pandemic has also become another vector of competition with different vaccine rollouts. We don't know how exactly the region will look like in terms of vaccine distribution, but already now there are certain trends that shows that perhaps we'll have very different zones of vaccines, right? Different contributors, different providers. And vaccine diplomacy had played a serious role so far. We've seen China very active in Cambodia, Philippines, Indonesia, for example. Less so, for example, in Vietnam. And Singapore. I think at the moment, as we speak, Singapore is the only country that have ranks well in recovery resiliency in the top 50 countries, in top 20 something countries, according to the recent Nikkei ranking. The rest, including Thailand and Vietnam, as I mentioned, and even Taiwan, which is not considered Southeast Asia, are really falling behind. And that has to do with both, how fast and effective they were to secure the vaccine in the supply chain, their diplomatic efforts, but also what I worry most is there will be a divide between the haves and the have-nots. And again, this is, a very versatile ground and very vulnerable place for the countries to be if we're talking about the great power competitions, right? And how countries that would utilize vaccine diplomacy for gaining influence and in the region. So in a way, I think to come back to your question, pandemic in the beginning, I think there are a lot of conclusions that pandemic didn't change the order, it only accelerated in the pre-existing trend. I think from the beginning, I took a little bit different point of view. I thought, yes, it accelerated some, but also slowed down others. So it's very uneven effect on different countries and different aspects. So it accelerated competition, but it slowed down countries' ability to react in many ways because it's so absorbing. It is taking over the state capacities in many ways. Right now, if you have strategic conversations about strategic issues with many countries in the region, that would not be their first priority for many of them. So some of them, yes, for example, Vietnam. But for many of my interlocutors in the region, the first and the foremost concern and focus will be vaccines and will be recovery and will be dealing with the pandemic. The Great Power Competition conversation is gradually taking a back burner side because everyone now is focusing on this Delta virus outbreak. So I think the virus will continue to stress the systems, the governance, and economic capacity of all countries in the region. They have different resilience in terms of both, governance and economic capacities to recover. So we are still in a very phase of, the pandemic unfolding. It's not yet any conclusion coming out of that, except for the thing that it will absorb countries' capacity. And in many ways, geopolitical trends are not waiting for anyone. China is absolutely still, advancing its own interests in the region. And so it is, at the moment, I think one of the most dangerous impact of it is taking away and it's absorbing the capacity to deal with many concurrent issues that is happening. So I don't want to take too much of the time, but I'll stop here and happy to engage in further questions.
Thank you, Huong. We might get back a little bit later, maybe in the Q&A section, to some of the points that you raised about great power competition and how COVID is sort of another vector of great power competition. But I would just like to follow up. I mean, the policy brief is really on Australia, Southeast Asia relations, and you've painted, I guess, a bit of a grim picture about just how slow the recovery phase might actually be, and some of those challenges around regional resilience. But I'm wondering, is it going to be more difficult now for Australia and Southeast Asian states to cooperate? Or does the situation actually provide some opportunities for deepening cooperation? And I would also note that your contribution to our brief looked at Australia, Vietnam in particular. So I'm wondering whether you can kind of comment on whether this regional security situation that's been so affected by COVID-19 might actually, whether it limits or whether it actually provides opportunities for deepening bilateral cooperation between Australia and Southeast Asian states.
I think Australia has been quite active in recent years and also during pandemic. I think Australia is one of the countries that have had a active, at least that's how it's seen from the region, a relatively active strategy of providing vaccines and engaging with the region in terms of recovery. We've seen Prime Minister Scott Morrison committing, over $500 million in the East Asia Summit late last year. Australia was very early to commit, pledge to Gavi, and is committing to vaccine partnership with through Quad partnership, through G7, and so on and so forth. So Australia is recognizing that this is a very critical moment for the region and wants to be a dependable and reliable partners and contribute to the vaccines. And I think that's a good recognition. But also there are a few complicating factors, including, Australia also has its own vaccine rollout organized before really effectively doing that abroad. I'm not vaccinated for that matter, for example. And there will be complicating factors as well with lack of direct communication visits, right? We have Prime Minister Scott Morrison visiting Singapore on the way to G7, right? We haven't had really, high-level visits for a while now, of course. Virtual meetings are happening still, but the fact that Australia wants to keep closed borders for some time will be a complicating factors as well in a little bit midterm over this period of time. So there are different answers to your question whether we're looking at short-term immediate responses or long-term. I think in long-term there are plenty of issues that hopefully Australia will keep engaging with the region, and just because it's our direct neighborhood, I still feel like every time talking about Southeast Asia, I still have to add a word on our doorstep, as if it needs to be reminded, otherwise it didn't matter as much. So there is that gap as well, but there are plenty of areas for cooperation for Australia and Southeast Asia in the long term. In the short and middle term is of course response to vaccines, response to the pandemic, vaccine rollout, and keeping the engagement and dialogue despite the distance and lack of physical contact.
I'm not vaccinated either, due to one of the disadvantages of age, I suppose. But Jeff, I might turn to you. How is geoeconomics shaping regional trends in Southeast Asia?
Oh, thanks very much, Beck. And I'm pleased to announce I will be Pfizered tomorrow, despite being just under 40 years old. Thank you to the Government of West Australia for bringing that down. Despite that personal anecdote, what I wanted to talk about was how geoeconomics has really become a fact of life strategically, politically and economically in Southeast Asia and the broader Indo-Pacific region. And what we've seen in recent years is the level of international rivalry between major powers has really stepped up again. A number of governments have turned to using economic tools to advance strategic agendas. This is particularly true of both the US and China, which have each used geoeconomic strategies to prosecute their great power rivalry, both between each other and in their dealings with third parties. And as a result of all of this, we've seen a number of geoeconomic battlegrounds emerging in the Indo-Pacific in recent years. These include things, I'm sure we're all familiar with these from reading the newspaper, stuff like trade warfare, particularly the massive US-China trade war that has seen tariffs applied to $700 billion of global trade. Infrastructure races catalysed by China's Belt and Road Initiative and other competing infrastructure proposals that have come up against that. We've also seen institutional competition between different free trade blocs, such as the TPP and RCEP. And indeed, as Huong talks about, we're also in the last couple of months, seeing vaccine diplomacy as another front as well. Now, I'd argue that these forms of geoeconomic competition are a really serious threat to the national interests of both Australia and Southeast Asian economies. The reason is that we're all either small or medium-sized economies and lack the size and scale and heft to engage in a geoeconomic battle with a great power like the US or China on our own. Australia and Southeast Asia are all very open economies with very high intensity to foreign investment and trade. And so this means that any interruptions or distortions to our trade investment relations caused by geopolitics have an outsized effect on our economies that are much larger than you'd see in other economies around the world. And I think the challenge has also been compounded because until now, both Southeast Asia and Australia have tried to respond and in some cases defend against some of these geoeconomic threats, largely individually and unilaterally. So when there's been complex rivalries over competing infrastructure proposals, Southeast Asian countries have largely tried to manage their investment ties with China and Japan and others individually. when we've seen the use of coercive trade sanctions from China, which in the last decade's been experienced by Vietnam, the Philippines and Australia at various times, we respond to that bilaterally alone. And when global institutions like the WTO start to break down, in the WTO's case, due to American vetoes, we make individual but pretty largely ineffective representations for the need for a rules-based economic order. And so I think the core problem facing both Southeast Asia and Australia at the moment is that these individual responses are unlikely to unscramble the egg. A medium-sized economy, say in Australia or in Indonesia or Malaysia, simply doesn't have the capability to push back against geo-economic plays by a great power. And then if we turn our attention to some of the smaller developing country members of ASEAN, they've got almost none. And so I think what this means is that at the moment, geoeconomics has both become one of the major battlegrounds driving the strategic game in Southeast Asia, but equally that the individual responses we've taken aren't really working and are failing to deliver the response that both Southeast Asia and Australia needs.
I think you've hit on one of the key issues here. In the Australian context, we talk quite a lot about things like trade, diversification, and that has a lot of support. We know from the Lowy Institute polling that the idea of diversifying our economy away from China is quite popular. And you've talked about the fact that individual responses from states are inadequate. So I guess the real question is, how can Australia and Southeast Asia states and even states outside of this region cooperate in the economic realm? How can they do things multilaterally rather than individually to try and defend, whether it's shared interests or whether it's a shared economic rules-based order? You mentioned the World Trade Organization, or whether it's trying to counter adverse geoeconomic tactics of states such as China. How can these, what's stopping these states from countering adverse geoeconomic strategies, working together to counter these tactics?
I think it almost requires us to change the way we think around Australia-Southeast Asia economic relations, which for a long time has been a kind of trade and investment promotion agenda. How can we sell each other more stuff and how can we invest in each other more? So it's even then has been quite bilateral. And given we've got this shared interest in protecting rules-based economic interactions in the face of these geoeconomic challenges, that we possibly need to start making this part of the Australia-Southeast Asia shared agenda as well. And there's one really good example that we've already begun moving in this direction. And that's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP agreement, which was signed in November last year. While it hasn't attracted a lot of attention, it's a critical and probably our best plank in the defence of a regional rules-based economic system. If you measure it by GDP, RCEP's the largest regional trade agreement ever signed. In fact, it's the second largest trade agreement behind the WTO itself. And it establishes an integrated trade bloc amongst all the major economies in the Indo-Pacific. This is a serious achievement because it's been delivered amidst a growing wave of protectionism globally and, of course, the ravages of the COVID pandemic. So to see this agreement get signed last year and midwifed by Vietnam, of all countries, through the ASEAN summit season in November is a really landmark achievement. And it also demonstrates the possibility and utility of using these multilateral strategies for economic cooperation. Contrary to some views, RCEP is not a China-led trade bloc. Indeed, it's an ASEAN-centred trade agreement, and the rules and provisions in the agreement specifically reflect the economic and developmental needs of Southeast Asian economies. The fact that it also includes Japan, Korea, Australia and New Zealand ensures that all the major economies in the region are present. So we've got everyone, including China, all agreeing to the same set of rules. I think this is really significant. But there's probably a lot more we could do. And one I'd just pick off really quickly would be the global trade architecture, where the WTO is facing several major crises. I won't bog our seminar up with a whole lot of WTO trade legalese this afternoon, but it's fair to say that neither Australia or any ASEAN country has the individual heft to really change what's going on in Geneva on our own. But if we could coordinate that contribution, we'd be able to make a significantly greater result in terms of those global discussions about getting the WTO working again. So that would be something where that coordination would be a force multiplier for Australia and Southeast Asian governments in our ability to project our interests and views into global fora like the WTO.
Thank you. Well, both Jeff and Huong mentioned vaccine diplomacy. So Caitlyn, I was hoping that you might talk a little bit about vaccine diplomacy and also the other term that gets used, vaccine nationalism. How are these vaccine diplomacy, vaccine nationalism dynamics playing out in Southeast Asia?
Thanks, Beck, and thank you again for inviting us all here tonight. I'm joining you from the Turrbal and Jagera lands up here in Brisbane, and it's really a pleasure to be catching up with those here in the panel, but also a shout out to all of those in the audience. Great to see so many familiar names. So yeah, Beck, you've mentioned this idea of vaccine nationalism, and I think since the outbreak of the pandemic, we have heard quite a few warning calls, particularly from the WHO, but from other organisations, about the role that vaccine nationalism could play. And that really relates to the idea of governments pushing hard to get first access to the supply of vaccines, potentially to hoard key components for vaccine production, and also use vaccines in the great diplomatic game for their own strategic purposes. So I think we've seen this play out, and in particular in Southeast Asia. And it is a problem because it can have some really serious negative consequences on how well the global pandemic is managed and contained across the region. Typically, we've seen those rich Western nations are the ones buying up vaccine doses. In some cases, and I think it's important to make the point that, of course, people do expect their governments to be looking after them. So to a certain degree, you can understand this. But we're seeing nations that are buying up doses in an order of magnitude that well outstrips the need of the population, while other countries have limited access or no means for access to a vaccine supply. And this isn't anything new. We've seen this kind of my country first approach on a whole range of issues, but we've seen it before in terms of pandemics, in particular when countries were scrambling to secure swine flu vaccinations in 2009. The outcomes then and the outcomes that potentially will play out today relate to the uneven distribution of vaccines based on purchasing power rather than a coordinated needs-based approach, and that's an issue. So there's been some research undertaken, in particular by the RAND Europe Corporation, and they've done this in collaboration with the Gavi Alliance that sits behind the COVAX mechanism. And they've really discovered that this kind of unequal allocation of COVID-19 vaccines is going to cost us. It's going to cost us potentially in human terms, well, definitely in human terms, because we're not going to see people who need to be vaccinated actually receive the vaccinations they need. But we're also going to see a cost in economic terms. And this is particularly the case when we are not going to, any of us, be in a better place in terms of recovery from the virus until we are all vaccinated. So potentially the cost of that unequal allocation of vaccines is going to be up to about 1.2 trillion a year in GDP terms. So I think, it's really important to think about the impact of vaccine nationalism, but also how that plays into the diplomatic game and how states are seeking to gain strategic leverage through the supply of vaccines, whether it's done through preferential deals, whether it's gifting, whether it's deals based on human trials in different countries, and we've seen that at play as well. These are not necessarily deals that are done on the basis of mutual benefit or reciprocity. And I think we've got to be really careful in critiquing and challenging the way that vaccine nationalism plays into these multiple dimensions of how we're actually working across the globe to respond and recover from the virus.
Well, just on that issue of, how states might be able to coordinate rather than focusing just on their own individual national interests, it was mentioned before that Australia's vaccine rollout has faced some challenges, but how have Australia and Southeast Asian states been cooperating on vaccine delivery or distribution or the rollout? Has there been much coordination or cooperation in this area, and can more be done?
Yeah, look, and I think there's always more to be done, but I think Australia certainly stepped up its response across the region, firstly in rhetoric and talking about the fact that it needed to respond to the region. Of course, that has been directed first and foremost to our Pacific neighbourhood, but also reaching across and into Southeast Asia. And we're seeing such uneven numbers. In some cases in Indonesia, the daily rates are really incredibly high. Also in Malaysia, Thailand, per million people of population. In other countries, we're not seeing the same kinds of rates, but of course, again, reporting is an issue. But Australia certainly has stepped up its rhetoric and its response across the region. I think that's been quite an important part of Australia's own diplomatic engagement with the region, and it is about demonstrating that we are, I think, as Huong has already mentioned, a partner of choice in the region, and we're doing this at a time of significant, as Jeff's already mentioned, geostrategic and geoeconomic competition. So it's important that we are involved diplomatically in this space. Australia's already committed 500 million to support access across the region to safe and effective vaccines. And the rhetoric talks quite a bit about wraparound support. So this is not just about vaccine delivery, but it's about the kind of technical and medical support that goes with that. And that's really important. There have been a range of other measures, including 21 million to fund an ASEAN Centre for Public Health Emergencies and Emerging Diseases, as well as ongoing bilateral programs. And I think this is important as well for Southeast Asia, that has typically worked quite well and in a coordinated way. They've got experience in dealing with pandemics from previous experiences. So it is important to really support and keep building on the policy initiatives that have been in place for some time. So Australia has been working and thinking about the region. We've also seen Australia make some announcements through other arrangements, including the Quad, as Huong had already mentioned, 100 million there to support a Quad initiative. Now, I think we're going to have to watch that, and in particular watch how India is able to continue to play a role in that particular initiative. That's not for sure, given India's own positioning right now with the virus. The other thing is that Prime Minister Morrison at the recent G7 meeting made a commitment to the G7 initiative to contribute 20 million new COVID-19 vaccine doses that will go to the region. So we're seeing a range of partnerships and initiatives bilaterally, in minilateral groupings. And of course, Australia is also a contributor to that COVAX mechanism, providing, I think it's 130 million into that COVAX mechanism. That's going to play a really important role for a number of countries in the region. 6 ASEAN member countries are involved in that COVAX rollout as well, if you include Timor-Leste in the Southeast Asian picture as well. So that brings it to 7. So there are multiple avenues for supporting the region, and that's really important as we think about recovery. But of course, COVID-19 casts a long shadow, and I think thinking just beyond the development and distribution of vaccines to much deeper economic support that is going to go on for time will be really important from an Australian perspective, and thinking about Australia's partnership in the region. It's also probably worth just making the point that in the recent Lowy poll on Australia's views of the world, generally speaking, Australians are really supportive of Australia's development assistance, particularly through the vaccine program, through both Southeast Asia and the Pacific. I think 80% of Australians see our support of Pacific Island nations through vaccine distribution as being really important, and 60% plus for Southeast Asia. Now, that's a really important sign of domestic support for these kinds of programs, and I think we need to build on that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting stat. I'm glad that you raised that one, Caitlyn. And maybe in the Q&A, we might get back to some of the sort of functional issues about what having a kind of fortress Australia mentality might also mean for our diplomatic relations and engagements. But Chen, I wanted to bring you into the conversation because you've written a piece for the policy brief that talks about the Singaporean-Australia bilateral relationship. And, you know, perhaps this is one that we don't spend a lot of time or enough time considering. So what shared interests do Australia and Singapore have as the regional order continues to evolve?
Well, thank you very much, Beck. It's great to be here, to see so many familiar faces, and thank you for this great partnership that Asialink has always had with Trobe Asia. So Singapore and Australia share a very deep and multifaceted relationship. If anyone has been a Singapore Australia watcher, you would know this just based on the fact that, you know, both countries have a comprehensive strategic partnership that's halfway through and anchor on 5 critical pillars: defense, economics, trade, people to people, just being a few of them. And there's strong trade relations between the two countries, not to mention people to people linkages. And Australia is actually the primary destination for a lot of Singaporeans, students who are seeking higher education. So the current border closure of Australia is actually affecting Singapore in more ways than you can imagine at a personal level. And it has withstood the test of COVID because when there were a lot of border closures, air freight between the two countries did not stop at all. In fact, I was told that it took about a week to convert the passenger flights into cargo flights. So I think it does send a really strong signal that relations are really important. And therefore, you know, it didn't take long to basically do something that it's really to transform something that into something that's really pragmatic, despite border closures. And I think this relationship, this strong relationship between the two countries was really affirmed in June between the meeting between Morrison and Lee Hsien Loong in Singapore when Morrison was en route to the G7 meeting in Cornwall. And they, of course, discussed the travel bubble. And again, if you follow the news of Australia's travel bubble, Singapore is the only other country that Australia is considering a travel bubble apart from New Zealand. Again, it tells you a lot about trust that is embedded in the mindset of both leaders, both countries for a very long time. Now, both countries obviously share a lot in common when it comes to the regional order, and there is a lot of respect, and I think for rule of law and for a very open multilateral trading system. And I think Jeb also mentioned that as a result of that, both countries are also extremely exposed to what's happening between US and China, particularly the trade war as well. Both countries also have a shared interest in seeing sustained US engagement and presence in the Indo-Pacific. So, and I know there's been a lot of talk in the last few years under the Trump administration where US was seen as retreating. And I will let you know that that was something that was that really struck concerns amongst Singaporean policymakers and scholars and academics, because like Australia, Singapore also has a strong security arrangement with the US as well. And both countries also have a shared interest in regional peace and stability. It seems like something really obvious to say, but it is really what this sort of desire to see regional peace and stability is also a reason why Singapore is such a strong supporter of ASEAN as a keynote in the regional architecture, as a key convener and facilitator of great power conversations as well. And I guess sort of the other aspect that both countries share is perception of common threats in the region. And I'm talking about things such as the rise of fundamental Islamism, terrorism related to that, cyber terrorism, and also concerns about freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. And in that regard, Singapore and Australia have a lot of defense cooperation along those lines as well, because they have the shared view of what these threats are, and therefore there's a lot of deep cooperation to try to counter those threats. And I guess last but not least, I like to think of Singapore and Australia as sort of really like-minded partners who have this common strategic view of the region. They're both middle-sized powers, even though Singapore, by virtue of its size, is considered a small country, but by virtue of, its financial health as well as strategic relationship with countries, well, I would consider a middle-sized country in that regard. And that with both countries that are not without agency when it comes to navigating a much more contested Indo-Pacific region, and also, mentioning and also managing these great power relations. So I think in that regard, it is a relationship that I see has withstood the test of time and has withstood the test of COVID as well, and hopefully it should progress sort of on the same trajectory in the next few years.
Well, that's what I was hoping to press you on a little bit further. But before I ask my next question, just a reminder, please put your questions in the Q&A box. We will be getting to Q&A shortly. I see there's already one in there from Kyle. Hi, Kyle. But I did want to ask Chen a follow-up question. I'm glad that you mentioned the travel bubble with Singapore, because I'm sure I'm not the only one here who would really like to see that implemented. But just on this kind of idea of the trajectory, I guess, of Australia-Singapore relations, has the pandemic provided greater impetus for Australia and Singapore to work more closely together, aside, putting aside of course, the travel bubble which you've already mentioned. But, how can bilateral ties, I guess, be developed or strengthened in the future, in your view?
Well, I think there are opportunities for deepening of the bilateral relations, and I would just highlight two particular areas. One is related to climate change, and that was already mentioned in any case by both leaders when they met. But what I'm looking at, it's really seeing COVID as a great reset for sustainable and inclusive economic recovery. This is not a nice to have thing. It is almost critical because the region is so prone to natural disasters, and there is even pre-COVID, there was a realization amongst most Southeast Asian nations that if they do not switch to a low carbon economic growth in the next 10 or 20 years, the countries are going to suffer. So that shift towards sustainable development was already on track before COVID. But I think COVID as the great reset provides that opportunity for governments, policymakers, and businesses to really rethink the way in which business should be conducted or government running should be conducted in the future. And in that regard, I think there is potential for Australia and Singapore to work in this respect. And Singapore is sort of the front runner amongst Southeast Asian countries when it comes to this area. In the last sort of 1 year or so, the government, the Singapore government, well, I like to think that they're usually quite visionary in the way they think. So in the midst of COVID, they saw it as an opportunity to announce a Singapore Green Plan 2030, which is an all-encompassing plan as to how the nation as a whole can start to become a much more greener city-state. And then Temasek, which is the country's sovereign wealth fund, also announced that climate change is going to be the biggest consideration of its investment strategy moving forward. And I know that Temasek has invested in Australian companies here, but I'm not sure how big the portfolio is, but it invests in companies all over the world. So that's going to signal a shift in the way companies globally would think as well. And then of course, one area which I want to mention, which was sort of what Jeff was talking about when it comes to geoeconomics as well, is infrastructure financing. I think there is, we spoke about multilateralizing infrastructure funding. And along with that, the important part is it has to be sustainable infrastructure. And in that respect, this is an area where I think Australia can also work very much with Singapore in pushing for the multilateralizing of infrastructure funding, but also much more sustainable infrastructure development. And it's sort of already happening. Singapore set up the Infrastructure Asia office several years ago as a way to ensure that infrastructure projects in the region become much more bankable, and that it's leveraging on private sector financing as well, which provides a bit of a counteract to China's BRI, even though it wasn't propositioned in this way, but it was a way to ensure that the region has the funding that it needs. And you would know that Australia also has set up the Blue Dot Network together with Japan as well. And I think in that regard, Australia is also trying to counteract geoeconomics, if you like to call it, in the infrastructure space. And the infrastructure space is very much related to inclusive economic recovery, just because it is such a critical aspect of economic development in the region, particularly in a country such as Indonesia, which we all know is such a critical partner of Australia in that regard. So that's one area where I think there's potential for deepening of bilateral relations between Australia and Singapore. The other area that I'd like to highlight is, of course, is in the digital economy space. Again, the digital economy space is something that already both leaders of both states have sort of committed to it through the Australia-Singapore Digital Economy Agreement 2020. And what it does, obviously, is enable interoperability, between the digital systems such as e-payments or fintech, cross-border data flows, etc. And I think, again, Singapore is a good regional hub to work with Australia in really capitalizing on this explosion of the digital economy in Southeast Asia, which Google has anticipated is worth more than 200 billion by 2025. And in the post-COVID context, the digital economy can be seen as a crucial part to accelerate economic recovery, but also in a sense, it's already stimulating the economy in ways such as it's enabling small and medium-sized entrepreneurs who previously couldn't tap into the global market to now have access to a much more global market through technologies, through apps. And there's a lot of examples of this in the case of Indonesia, for instance, Bukalapak, homegrown tech company, which uses really simple app, but it enables your mom and pop store in remote archipelago Indonesia to be able to sell their goods, really simple stuff, to anybody through a simple app like that. And the company has grown so much in the last few years. But what I'm saying is that that is a space which is just going to become even bigger as a result of COVID. And I think Australia has a lot, to bring to this space. And Singapore, being the regional hub for a lot of regional tech companies and global companies, such as Google, Netflix, Facebook, and then your regional companies like Grab, Lazada, can be, the perfect partner for Australia in working together in this regard.
It's really interesting. I mean, you've offered some really concrete examples, I think, of how Singapore and Australia can cooperate and engage, particularly in the economic realm. But we are now at Q&A, and we have Kyle Springer has a question. Your colleague there, Jeff, at the Perth US Asia Centre. And now I might give all of our panellists an opportunity to have a go at this question, and it is, what lessons have we learned for the next pandemic? I think this is a really excellent question. What kind of architecture does Australia and Southeast Asia need in place to prepare and better manage the next one? I am going to add my own question onto that one as well before I take it back to our panelists, and that is thinking about Australia's relationship with ASEAN as an institution, and whether our panelists have any insights on how Australia relates with ASEAN as an institution, and what kind of they might do better in that regard. So I might start with Huong. We might go around in the order in which you spoke originally. So Huong, you want to have a go at that one?
All right, thanks, Beck, and thanks, Kyle. I think, yeah, it's a tricky question because in a way, ASEAN countries have had their mechanism about the pandemic and communicable diseases for a long, long time. And as you know, some of our panelists mentioned, epidemics and pandemics are not new to the region. They have gone through several cases before, not to this scope as COVID, but still that wasn't enough. It wasn't a mechanism to draw upon, or at the beginning you saw coordination among ASEAN themselves as rather protracted. So even though they've had this kind of consultations and mechanism in place, so it's not that easy to have a ready template to go. I would say though that a lesson could be learned is that I think from the beginning and from what I remember in the media coverage in Australia in early days when the pandemic first happened in China and in neighboring Southeast Asian countries, reporting in Australia was still treating the matter as something that would stop in Asia. That would be and another epidemic. And when it hit here, I think there was an overall shock and a little bit of what to do now. Instead of we had several months to really prepare for that. So I think that is the first lesson to have, that pandemic won't stop at certain borders, they will go ahead, and that would be also a matter for Australia to deal with as much as it was for other Asian countries. So that's the first lesson. I think Australia is, Caitlyn mentioned that too, that is contributing to ASEAN mechanism and funds that would help in disaster responses and public health responses, a number of initiatives that's happening. So that would not, hopefully that would just not contribute to ASEAN only, but also that would include Australia as a partner. Australia has last year elevated its what was biannual summits to annual. So that's another vehicle, another avenue to step up and have more frequent consultations. And I think something that we as a bigger region, whether just Southeast Asia or broader Asia and in Asia Pacific, have to still work on is how do we treat that? How do we recognize this? Vaccines, because we have different vaccines now all over the region. We have Sinovac, Sinopharm, Sputnik V, and all Moderna, Pfizer, and AstraZeneca. How are they inter-recognized? Are they inter-recognized? Are certain countries going to open borders for the people who have ABC vaccines, right? Or what kind of rules on the quarantine would be? What kind of criteria for travel bubble to reopen, or even business communities to reopen? We don't have those standards in place, and certainly not unified, not harmonized standards is something we still have to work on quite seriously, because we don't want to end up in a region that is, zoned by vaccines rollout and types of vaccines that are being distributed.
Yeah, it's a really important point. Jeff, would you like to have a go at this question?
And let me assure everyone that I didn't put Kyle up to asking this question. No, look, the part of the question, and taking on from Huong there, is like, does Australia have, and Southeast Asia or ASEAN, sorry about that, have the right architecture in place? Look, we can argue about whether we did before, but my great fear is that we increasingly have gone backwards over the last 12 to 18 months. Couple of reasons for that. I mean, the first one's the pandemic itself. Diplomacy is inhibited by people moving across borders. Even the Australian Prime Minister has to do 2 weeks in quarantine after going to the G7 summit. And so it's really, you know, our officials are putting their bodies on the line physically to engage in diplomacy, and the intensity of that's really reduced. Particularly if you look around Southeast Asia, then what's the agenda space in Southeast Asia at the moment? It's COVID, 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 and at the ASEAN level, which we've talked about as well, Myanmar crisis. And on both of those fronts, look, Australia can kind of run the right direction, but Australia doesn't have a decisive or determinative contribution to make on either of those fronts unless we can start producing tens of millions of vaccines a week, which we can't. And the third one as well is the geopolitical competition overlay that's come in the last 12 months. Australia's got a China problem. Lots of countries have a China problem. Lots of countries have an America problem. And that has seen, there's no question, there's been a refocus of Australia's diplomacy on buttressing key great power relationships. Big pushes with the US and the Biden administration coming in, which is a great relief, but you've got to do that. Japan, India, the G7 summit as well. And so my fear in talking about all these great ideas we've got in the agenda here is because of those 3 factors, that the space for Australia, Southeast Asia, or Australia ASEAN as the body has just collapsed to a very narrow space. And there's not the people, we don't have the issues, and we're all looking elsewhere at the moment. I think that means that if whether or not we had it 2 years ago, we've got even less of it now. And it's very unclear to me what the path in the next 12 months would be to put that back together. Apologies for pessimism. Maybe my fellow panelists will have a more optimistic view.
Well, Caitlyn, what do you think? Is there an issue of bandwidth when it comes to Australia-Southeast Asia relations?
It's so fascinating, and I would agree with both Huong and Jeff in their kind of assessment. I think we're seeing these big strategic issues and fault lines exposed and amplified by COVID-19, and yet, you know, our policy landscape has in some ways become more myopic, in part because we simply can't engage in the way that we used to. We are forced onto these little screens, and so maintaining relationships, thinking about those big strategic issues is just almost beyond the capacity of many of us, you know, across policy domains. You know, even as we try to think in a more integrated approach to our policy landscape, it's becoming harder. It's becoming harder to coordinate inside our own borders, let alone across and with. I would like to come back to what we might have learned, though, in thinking about the pandemic and in thinking in particular about Southeast Asia, because I think some of these learnings have been there before because of previous experiences, and we need to remind ourselves about this. And if I can make a shout out for my colleague, Professor Sarah Davies, wrote a brilliant book Containing Contagion and the Politics of Disease Outbreak in Southeast Asia. You know, she didn't, whilst she did talk about the fact that pandemics were going to increasingly become a feature of life in the global community, she certainly didn't time the release of her book to coincide with COVID, but it happened to. And I think if you go back through some of the learnings that Sarah has identified by looking at different disease outbreaks in the region, you can see that we've had some lessons right in front of us around things like, you know, how we implement the international health regulations that have been adopted and updated by the WHO and adopted specifically for a Southeast Asian context through the Asia Pacific Strategy for Emerging Infectious Diseases. So we've got some of this architecture in place to really improve the way we detect, assess, notify and report on disease outbreaks. But there are still gaps. There are gaps in the way that we are coordinating some of this work nationally, but also when you think about archipelagic nations like Indonesia, like the Philippines, where there is an unevenness of topography, let alone demography, you know, we're not making the connections we need to make from national to subnational to very local in dealing with the issues that a pandemic presents. There are capacity issues in healthcare systems. You know, there are issues around access to protective equipment, active access to testing kits, good methods for testing and tracing and follow up. You know, these are really variable across the region. And so I think there's an opportunity to really think about the kind of capacity we need to build in, you know, in terms of building resilience within nations, and of course, building the kind of environment where we can share information, we can report on disease outbreaks and issues openly, transparently, you know, without fear of punitive action coming from that. So I think there are some really specific things to learn out of this pandemic that can offer some direction for our diplomacy and our development going forward. That's my answer to that question. But Beck, do you want to, shall we come back to your question on the state of play for Southeast Asia after this? Or do you want me to do it now?
No, we might come back to that, because I would like to get Chen's views on the lessons that we have learned from the pandemic, and maybe whether you can comment, Chen, on whether you're feeling optimistic or pessimistic about the space that there is for Australia and Southeast Asia to kind of deepen relations.
I don't know. It's pretty hard to be too optimistic when you're based in Australia and its borders are at the moment permanently closed for the, you know, indefinite foreseeable period. But what I can say is that, again, take it from Singapore and what it's trying to do, that is eventually when it moves to the next phase of its pandemic management, they won't be reporting the number of new cases anymore. And lockdown is not going to be a feature anymore. COVID will just be a pandemic we have to live with, we have to manage, and life should resume, you know, back to normality as much as possible. I mean, sure, we learned hard lessons from SARS, but this is not SARS. This is on a scale that is way much bigger than SARS, right? And what it does tell you is that the countries that have the resources to dip into basically did much better than the countries that are poorer and had a lot of governance and social development issues to deal with. Because when COVID first broke out last year in February, you find that it was the marginalized populations in most of, I can only speak for Southeast Asia, that were really getting, you know, the worst end of the stick when it comes to COVID. So, but these issues really pre-existed: the lack of social protection, lack of justice, etc., health systems, and COVID just made it worse for those who are not able to have access to these basic services. So I think it's good to put in place systems that you can rely on, so that even when the situation changes, you have different variant, much worse than Delta right now, you have a system to rely on, and that you're not changing the goalpost every time, which causes confusion in the minds of the public. And I think the mass media being, you know, a channel of public education and providing clear information without politicizing the COVID situation would really help as well in sending the right message to the people to do the right thing.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Caitlyn, I'm going to come back to you because our next question relates to vaccine equity and access. And this is from Ben Rolfe. Is there scope to encourage the Quad to do more on vaccine equity and access, almost as a further proof of concept for the Alliance? And if you would like to say anything about my, or respond to my question about relating with ASEAN as an institution, feel free to do so now.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Ben, for the question. You know, I think that we've seen some really interesting discussions amongst Quad leaders at the behest of President Biden coming in and calling a leaders meeting of the Quad with COVID-19 very firmly on the agenda, and the response, you know, thinking about the response that those four nations might be able to work out together. And they did work out a significant package to see, you know, I think 1 billion doses delivered across the Indo-Pacific region by 2022. Now, I think that was a positive development for the Quad itself. It moved it, you know, it gave it something quite concrete and productive to work towards. But I do wonder I think we're going to have to see how that initiative is delivered on, particularly given India's withdrawal from the export market and India's ability to produce and export vaccines as part of that package was pretty critical. So I don't know that it's necessarily time to push for more from the Quad. I think we need to see delivery on what's been agreed. But I think that was a positive move for Quad nations to actually engage in something quite practical and concrete, beyond the previous discussions that they'd had, which were very much more around the security landscape. In terms of the issue around the region, I guess I just wanted to comment on the fact that, I think what I'd hate to do is present a picture of Southeast Asia operating in this really diverse and dynamic environment without having agency in the process. And I think one of the things that has certainly come to the fore is that Southeast Asian nations have asserted their agency in different ways. They are working to secure vaccines from a variety of sources. And already we're seeing Pfizer, Moderna, Russia's Sputnik 5, Sinovac, Sinopharm, AstraZeneca, all being rolled out in different ways. And yes, it's uneven, but I think many Southeast Asian nations are really thinking very carefully about how to diversify their access to vaccines. So I think that's a really important point to make. How that plays out, though, for regional coherence, particularly within the ASEAN architecture, is really yet to be seen. And I just wonder if, in fact, that heightened agency of individual states who are all working to respond to their domestic populations at this crisis time, how that will translate at a regional level. If anything, I wonder if it exposes the increased opportunity or vulnerability for disaggregation at a regional level. So again, I think, if we're thinking about diplomacy, opportunities to support that regional coherence could be taken up by others, particularly Australia, thinking about how we help ASEAN nations or Southeast Asian nations work together, how we support the mechanisms within ASEAN to really ensure that regional coherence, because those vulnerabilities become vulnerabilities in a whole raft of other areas as well.
Now, Huong, I might get you to respond to what Caitlyn was just saying about, how to create, I guess, or support regional cohesion. But I'm also going to give you a question from good friend Hunter Marsden, who's a good friend of the Trobe Asia. Hi, Hunter, who says, thank you to all the speakers for their remarks. This question is to anyone who wants to speak to it, but I am throwing it to you, Huong. How would you differentiate Australia's Indo-Pacific or Southeast Asia outlook from that of the UK or the US? Are there certain strong points or lessons learned from observing the successes or failures of US policy, for example?
Well, the US Indo-Pacific strategy under Biden hopefully will differentiate in some degree from the Trump's era's Indo-Pacific strategy, although there are some elements that are supposedly to remain constant in it, including, the competition with China, at least rhetorical acknowledge to ASEAN centrality, which we yet to see in practice. So, I wouldn't comment exactly yet on the US Indo-Pacific strategy under Biden because we're still waiting for that to unfold. With Australia's, I think the previous phase of the Indo-Pacific strategy and the reception of that in the region has been mixed, to say the least. I think there were mixed feelings about the free and open Indo-Pacific under Trump. I think there was some resistance to that because of how then Secretary of State Pompeo promoted it. in a very binary way, and juxtaposing it really free from non-free, free from free meaning free as differentiated from the Chinese Communist Party, that non-free vision of the regional order or authoritarian way. I think Australia is much more careful in a way it promotes. It doesn't use in its documents free and open in a way that US did. But the Southeast Asian had been much of a favor of Japanese Indo-Pacific strategy, which is a revival of much older one, and put a lot of emphasis on development, connectivity, and really infrastructure, and really practical aspects of the Indo-Pacific. They all are different, I think, in a way, to a degree, at least up until a few years back when Prime Minister Modi gave a speech at Shangri-La. I think the Southeast Asian also were more receptive of that, because Modi also emphasizes Asia as a whole. We're having the whole place in the Indo-Pacific, so not excluding anyone, namely not excluding China. I think and ASEAN eventually come up with its own outlook on the Indo-Pacific, and in it explicitly rejected the a zero-sum great power competitions of it, really explicitly rejecting the American way of presenting it, at least, and that was under Trump. I think right now we lost a little bit of momentum in our ASEAN journey of the Indo-Pacific, obviously because of the COVID that has taken so much attention to it. There are, of course, some conversations within ASEAN what to do next, what is the next step, whether we implement. We have the outlook document there, what's the next step, but it's not really the main first and foremost focus at the moment. In ASEAN, I think it will also be, in a way, a response to what's going to happen with the respective other Indo-Pacific countries. Your question about the European Indo-Pacifics, I think it's also, everybody's also adopting a wait-and-see approach. Obviously, we have resident skeptics that already are flagging an issue. What are the ships, European ships doing in the South China Sea, and what are their intentions? But really, there is still a lot for the Europeans to do in terms of strategic communication with the region. What are their intentions? Obviously, they will be different. Indo-Pacific strategy coming from UK, individual EU countries, and the European Union as itself will come up with its own also in the near future. So I think that they're still shaping. Shaping that Indo-Pacific strategies. I did notice that they are much more careful and receptive of what Southeast Asian potentially could think. And so there had been a lot of consultation prior to rollout of the Indo-Pacific strategy, just to check what other opinions and reception could be. But I think there's a lot of strategic communication to be done yet from the European side, just because that is a strategy that is going to be other than just not rolling out. It also needs to be seen in practice. So that's what we're still waiting for.
Next question is for you, Jeff, from Brian Timms. How can RCEP prevent participating countries using economic or trade as geostrategic pressure against each other, such as what China has been doing to Australia?
Thanks, Ron. The short answer is if someone is committed to doing it, it can't. And indeed, nor can the World Trade Organization. There are international mechanisms for arbitration that are quasi-legal to deal with these things, but the wheels of justice tend to grind very slowly. So dispute resolution through trade agreements is really designed if there's just been a bit of misinterpretation between two parties and often takes 3 or 4 years to be resolved. Where if you're attempting to use trade as an economic sanction, the metaphor is that you can shoot first and answer the questions in 3 years' time, usually by which the point's been made. But RCEP does have something to do. And I would also just point out, this is not just a China issue as well. There is a trade war between Japan and Korea at the moment, which a lot of people don't know about, which has a significant diplomatic, geoeconomic element to it as well as one, a WTO case that's just been launched by Japan against China last week on the same thing. So this is not just a China-Australia or even just a China thing. But one of the reasons that RCEP's important is it actually finally gives the Indo-Pacific region, centred on Southeast Asia, a trading region as a whole. So we now have a single set of trade rules for all of the trade practices and customs and procedures and certificates of origin, a common and agreed set of tariff arrangements. And that's really going to increase the density and the ease of trading within the region across borders. For Australia, it's new FTAs with a couple of partners and greatly eased access in others. And what this is going to do is fundamentally get to a situation where you have a more networked region. And if you're a country like Australia or Indonesia or Japan, it actually aids that trade diversification agenda that you're going to get, which is going to be one of the key things going through for any country, in the region. You are more exposed to some of these geopolitical winds if you have a lot of eggs in one basket. That basket's often a Chinese basket, though not always a Chinese basket, depending on the country and the commodity. And an integrated EU-like, but not at the same standard as the EU trade bloc, actually lets countries like Australia have genuinely regional trade networks rather than one at the moment, whereas I'm sure we're all aware are heavily China dominant. So its contribution is to give us is to allow diversification in that sense, and of course justice in 4 years' time when we do have a Barney.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm going to turn the next question over to Chen. I mean, you mentioned people-to-people links just briefly in your presentation, but this question comes from Cameron from the ASEAN Australia Strategic Youth Partnership. And he says that he's been reading Chessboard and the Web by Anne-Marie Slaughter, which espouses an IR worldview based on network theory, focused on the importance of networks between people and organisations. So what I sort of just described as people-to-people links. So in your view, does Australia's foreign policy in Southeast Asia overemphasise power politics while undervaluing the importance of embedding ourselves in informal networks? In Myanmar, for example, would Australia benefit from leveraging more non-state engagement to influence networks of activists rather than focusing on government or state-based tools like sanctions? That's a pretty big question, but I'm sure that you have something interesting to contribute, Chen.
Wow, that's a tough one. And I think it really depends on, it also depends on which country you're talking about as well. I think, Australia's relations with ASEAN at the end of the day with the regional organizations as a whole, I think is pretty strong. I think Australia's ambassador to ASEAN, who's based in Jakarta, has always played a very active role diplomatically. And that is shored up by the development assistance that Australia has been providing to the region, not just through the AEDCP2, which stands for Australia ASEAN Development Cooperation Program, but also a whole raft of other programs in the area of counter-trafficking, a free trade agreement, and a new program, I think, on transnational crime in the Mekong region. But at the individual member state, and usually that is sort of where it matters the most, Australia's soft power or diplomatic influence is how active the embassy has been in reaching out to both state and non-state actors. And that's where Cameron's question of networks is important. I'm not sure what the state of play is in Myanmar, but I can tell you, at least in Singapore, where I was at before I moved to Melbourne, Australia embassy in Singapore was very quiet. There is not a lot of networking activities that has been organized by the embassy for outreach to the non-government sector, to scholars, and even at events organized by other embassies, you're hard pressed to find an Australian diplomat there. So I think I would, I'll end it at there. Obviously, these, community networks, it's highly important. And yes, it's a big part of the diplomatic toolkit, I would say.
We do have a couple of articles in the policy brief that were written by our colleagues at the Asia Centre that really make this point very explicit, Cameron, about the importance of people-to-people relations and the importance of sort of non-state networks. So you might be interested in reading those pieces, and particularly in relation to sort of supporting, I guess, civil liberties and rights within Southeast Asian countries. But our next question, I'm going to come back to Huong. This is from Melissa Conley-Tyler, another good friend of ours. How much might Australia's relations with China be a factor in Australia-Southeast Asia relations going forward? Thinking about the advice that Prime Minister Lee provided to Scott Morrison during his recent visit to Singapore.
Yes, I saw that. I was following that visit and following the comments that both Prime Ministers made as well. I think in my general, when I give presentations in different defense colleges and different Australian public service and other trainings, I always say that, because the first, a lot of time I get a question how Australia is being seen in Southeast Asia is one of the kind of constant question I get. And in my presentation, I always, structure the presentation and one key factor is how Australia's China relation is looking at. So that's also an aspect that certain regional countries will affect their views of Australia. And I think we've seen that reflected in a number of comments from colleagues in the region, not only the comments that you quoted of Prime Minister Lee, but also colleagues in the region from Indonesia and Malaysia saying that it looks like from where they stand as if there's nothing that China can do that Australia would approve of, nothing is good, and then there's situation is so tense, going just a spiral downwards. And I think the ability to manage or lack of ability to manage that relationship is also contributing to Australia's perception of Australia in the region. But having said that, I would say also that the perception of Australia in the region it really depends on which country you're asking. I don't think that is necessarily a view that I quoted from Indonesia or Malaysia wouldn't be necessarily a view in Vietnam, for example. I think the Vietnamese value Australia's principled and approach and withholding to the international law and willingness to stand up in the maritime issues. So I think that's actually well received. For countries who have gone through cases and examples of Chinese coercion, I think they can empathize and relate to and certainly understand. I think the fact that Australia accept the fallout and it is a conscious decision and follows through, it's also in a way respectable for many. It is not a situation that many of Southeast Asian countries would want to find themselves in, but certainly not completely foreign to them, especially for those that I said have also experienced similar coercive practice from China. So it's a very varied mixed picture. I think one key difference is that it's between Southeast Asia and Australia is that I think most of Southeast Asian envy Australia, the geography, something that I can't afford. Again, geographic natural predisposition is Australia's strongest asset in this context. So this is a lot of things that maybe even some of them would ponder or would want to try, but probably can't afford that easily given the geographic and of course other aspects, being security assurance that they also don't have, similar to the one that Australia has.
I might just get Chen, if you can shed some light on Prime Minister Lee's comments to Scott Morrison.
Thanks, Beck, and thanks, Melissa, for the question. I hope Taipei is treating you well, presuming that's where you are right now. So I just want to quote Lee Hsien Loong on one of the things that he said to Scott Morrison, which is deal with China as issues in a partnership you want to keep going and not issues which add up to adversity. And I think that's really the view of Singapore and many Southeast Asian nations when it comes to China, that Australia's current anti-China policy is a bit of a concern for several Southeast Asian nations, simply because China is a major economic power and creditor and trade partner in Southeast Asia, and the region's economic recovery cannot occur without China being a huge part of it. And that's a huge reality for ASEAN countries. Southeast Asia has a contiguous relationship with China. It is a reality on our doorstep. And Prime Minister Lee is right when he said that we have to work with it. We can't, we can't just cast it aside. And that's not to say that, China is highly trusted within ASEAN as well. We've got to make that distinction. In fact, I think in the last Institute of Southeast Asian survey, which was just released this year, there's a high level of distrust of China and its political intentions or geo-economic intentions too in ASEAN region. And this has not gone unnoticed by a lot of ASEAN leaders as well. And it's also evident in a way in which certain projects have been cancelled or put on hold, like the Midson Dam in Myanmar, and also cancellation of several infrastructure projects in Indonesia, and also some Mekong Rapids blasting projects by the Thai government as well, which was seen as a win by the civil society because they were so concerned about the environmental damage that will be inflicted on the Mekong River. And then on the issue of Sinovac, Indonesia is obviously receiving a lot of vaccine from China, not because it wants to, because China is the only country that can produce the quantity that Indonesia needs. So it's in this, so as I said, Southeast Asian countries have to hedge against US, China in this regard, and China is always going to be there. And therefore, in that context, Lee Hsien Loong was just being extremely pragmatic in a way in which, he sees China and treats the relationship.
Jeff, do you have anything to add to this discussion?
Thanks. And look, I'd agree with a lot of the comments there, actually. Like, it's very interesting the way that these Lee Hsien Loong comments were reported in Australia, and that they were said, Singapore Prime Minister gives Australia a lesson in how to deal with China, which I think kind of reflected some Australian fears in that, because if you kind of look at it, there's another way to read that comment, which is, you have to live with China, right? Like it's in a way, the comment itself recognises a lot of the fundamental issues that are at play there. And Australia, I think it's right. A lot of Southeast Asian countries would be envious of Australia. We don't have maritime disputes in the South China Sea that are actually affecting. Yeah, there's a SLOCS issue. Obviously, if the sea gets closed, it's a nightmare for the whole world. But we don't have territorial stakes in question. Economically, Australia doesn't depend on Chinese investment, and we have this giant mining industry that can't get sanctioned because Chinese industry needs it. So that's ring-fenced from geopolitics because of the brute reality of China's industrial economic needs. I think it's pretty unsurprising, therefore, that Singapore's a city-state, right? Like, it's completely unsurprising that Singapore would be in a different position. And I think it's very strange that the way commentators, certainly in Australia, and I understand it sometimes it really does reflect, and for us as Australians, the blessed, in some respects, strategic position that Australia is in on some of these issues. And so I wouldn't see that as evidence of a break or a rift in the way that some of the more, red blood, sanguine analysis has tried to offer it.
Now, last word will go to Caitlyn. You might have something to contribute to the discussion, but I'm also going to throw you one last question from our audience, from Russell Darnley. This is one that I know is close to both of our hearts, and that is about the decline of languages in Australia and how that might affect our diplomatic and engagement capabilities in the future.
Thanks, Beck. Can I also just make a quick qualifier? I've realised my 16-year-old son has just fired up his electric guitar in the room next door. If it starts, I'm sorry, texted him, but he may not realise.
Just adds to the entertainment, Caitlyn. It can be the band that ends the webinar.
You heard it here first. Look, Russell, thank you. And I did read your comment with real interest, given you are someone who's living in Indonesia. You've been watching this space and, you know, for many years. And I think your comment is absolutely spot on. You know, we've seen a real decline in language studies over the past several decades, but in particular over the last 12 months. And yet never has there been a more compelling time for us to be skilling up, for us to be thinking about, you know, the range of capabilities that we're going to be needing, language, intercultural, but also technological, to navigate what is going to be a volatile, complex, really ambiguous future across the Asia-Pacific region. And the fact that we're seeing that decline in Indonesian language studies, I think is you know, really concerning. This has been a debate that has been taking place in Australia on a kind of cyclical basis for several decades. In fact, you can go back to 1913 to see some of those early debates emerging about Australia skilling itself up to engage with the region around it. I was involved with some work done by the Australia Task Force, and Asialink, Asia Society. Asialink was also involved, BCA, Business Councils of Australia project, to actually look at some of these issues. And, you know, whilst it's great to see programs like the New Colombo Plan continue and have committed funding, at least for now, that is not enough. And we do have to see greater investment in specialised skills, including in language, in our universities, you know, but we're not seeing that. So I think there are some real issues at play here that just undermine our ability going forward to engage with our region. I might leave it at that. You know, certainly not Indonesia. I think we've got to think of ourselves and think of the trans-regional capabilities we are going to need. So we really need this to, you know, the rite of passage needs to be much more than simply a couple of weeks in studying in country. It needs to have much greater depth, and it needs to be about our longer term relationships with people, with institutions, and at a national level right across Southeast Asia. There's a lot of work to be done here.
Indeed. Well, I'm afraid that is all we have time for this evening. I'm sorry to those who didn't get their questions answered tonight. I was really pleased to see how many fantastic questions were in the Q&A box. I'm glad, Jeff, that your internet only started crashing right at the end. That is of great relief. But I would like to thank all of our panelists and thank our audience for watching this La Trobe Asia event, which of course is brought to you in collaboration with our great partners who have been involved in this partnership. This webinar has been recorded. If you've registered